Alright, what is up there YouTube? This is G-Man Time, and today I have a video on some Swedish anti-aircraft weapons of the Second World War. During World War II, Sweden was actually a neutral player in the Second World War. Although not involved directly in the conflict, Sweden did export raw materials to both the Axis and Allied powers during the Second World War. And one of the reasons why Sweden was neutral is because they didn't want their territory and cities being destroyed. But at the same time, both the Axis and Allied powers actually did have invasion plans for Sweden, but no one was willing to put their invasion plans into fruition, knowing full well that Sweden was pretty well armed for an independent Scandinavian country. Both Sweden and Finland were the two most armed nations in Scandinavia, and Finland was powerful enough to slow down the Soviet Union during their field invasion in 1939. So let's go over one of Sweden's best defensive weapons, and these are the Swedish anti-aircraft systems of the Second World War. The first anti-aircraft system used by Sweden in World War II is the Bofors 20mm machine cannon M40S, and this is also known as the Pansarvärns Luftvärnskannon M40. And this is a dual-purpose anti-aircraft autocannon that was developed between 1938 and 1940. Entering service in 1940, this weapon here also doubled as an anti-tank weapon, and some of these were even given to Finland during the Winter War and during the continuation wars between 1939 and 1944. The weapon was chambered for the 20 by 145mm cartridge, or anti-tank cartridge, which was capable of penetrating at least 12 to 35mm of armor, meaning it could take out most of the Soviet light tanks and even the German light tanks if Germany wanted to invade Sweden at any point in the Second World War. The weapon was fed by a 28-round magazine and had a rate of fire of 360 rounds per minute and a maximum firing range of 2,400 meters or 7,900 feet. This was the second most common anti-aircraft system in the Swedish military during the Second World War, with the exception of the Bofors 40mm AA gun. And this weapon was available to both the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The next weapon on the list is the Bofors 25mm M32, or the Pansarvärns Luftvärnskannon M32. And this too was a dual-purpose anti-aircraft autocannon from the year 1932. And it was largely designed for use in the Swedish Navy on board Swedish warships, especially the Swedish coastal defense ships or coastal battleships and the Swedish submarine fleet, which also used anti-aircraft autocannons. This weapon was chambered for the 25 by 205mm rim cartridge and was fed by 6-round stripper clips, and each barrel had a rate of fire of 160 rounds per minute and a maximum firing range of 5.6 kilometers or 18,000 feet. There was also a second version of this weapon which had 2 barrels, a dual-barreled version. This weapon was actually designed during the same time period as the Bofors 40mm. The 40mm was initially viewed as being too heavy for the Swedish Navy, so the 25mm was the one that was mostly fitted to Swedish warships. Some of these 25mm were also used on Swedish anti-aircraft batteries located on land and around various Swedish military bases and in major towns and cities throughout Sweden, for example, the capital of Stockholm. The next anti-aircraft system is the one that most people know when it comes to Swedish anti-aircraft weapons, and that is the Bofors 40mm machine cannon M36, or the Pansarvärns Luftvärnskannon M36, or simply the Swedish 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft autocannon from 1932. The version we are most familiar with came out in 1940, and this is the version that was later exported to both the UK and the United States during the Second World War. It was later manufactured by both the United States and Great Britain during World War II as simply the L60 and L70 series of Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft autocannon. And the first version was chambered for the 40 by 311mm cartridge, although this was later upgraded to several other cartridges later on. The weapon was fed by a 6-round striker clip and had a rate of fire of 120 rounds per minute or 120 rounds per barrel. And there were dozens of variations of this weapon, a twin version and also a 4-barreled version. The maximum firing range was 7,160 meters, or 23,490 feet. And these weapons were some of the best anti-aircraft systems of World War II. Some of these 40mm Bofors were actually captured by the Germans in places like Poland and the Netherlands and Denmark, and were later used by the German anti-aircraft ground crews against Allied forces. So the Bofors 40mm was actually used on both sides of World War II. These were also captured by the Imperial Japanese forces during the Japanese offensives throughout the Pacific theater and were later used against U.S. forces. So the Bofors 40mm was pretty much used by both sides in both theaters of World War II. Another heavier anti-aircraft system was the Bofors 75mm Model 1929, and this was the standard heavy anti-aircraft gun used by the Swedish anti-aircraft defense forces. The system was developed between 1929 and 1930, and there are actually two versions of this. The first version being chambered for the 75 by 604mm shell, and there's also an export version. There was also an export version developed for Hungary and Greece, known as the 80mm Luftwaffenkanone M36, which was pretty much the same gun, scaled up to 80mm, and these were largely exported to Hungary and Greece and several other smaller nations, and also Finland during the Winter Wars. And this weapon system had a rate of fire of 15 to 20 rounds per minute, and it had a maximum firing range of 11 kilometers or 36,000 feet. This weapon could also be used as an anti-tank weapon, just like the German 88mm anti-tank gun. So if Germany had ever tried to invade Sweden, they would have come in contact with the Swedish equivalent to the 88mm flak. And keep in mind, the Swedish armed forces during the Second World War used both the 75mm, and they also had some of the 80mm export guns in service with the Swedish anti-aircraft defense units of the Swedish armed forces during the Second World War. So the Bofors 75mm M1929 was pretty much the equivalent of the 88mm flak, especially the 80mm variant. And then finally, there is a rare anti-aircraft vehicle known as the Landsberg L-60 Anti-2 and Anti-1. And this was a series of anti-aircraft / anti-tank vehicles developed between 1940 and 1941. These were medium tanks that were fitted with the standard Bofors 40mm L-60 gun as an anti-aircraft auto weapon, but could also be used as an anti-tank weapon, as the 40mm round was capable of penetrating upwards to 35 to 50 millimeters of armor at ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards. And this is an autocannon, keep in mind. So this is automatic fire instead of the single-shot rounds you would normally see for most anti-tank guns or most tank destroyers. This vehicle here pretty much was an anti-tank / anti-aircraft platform. It was an anti-aircraft weapon that could be used to destroy enemy tanks at the same time. And keep in mind, the 40mm round couldn't do any damage to any of the heavy tanks used by either the Germans or the Soviets. For example, the German Tiger tank or the Soviet KV-1 series, as those tanks had armor thickness that was way too thick for the 40mm to penetrate. In fact, the 40mm wouldn't be able to penetrate the armor of the Panther tanks used by the Germans later on in World War II, or even the Soviet IS tanks, or even some of the T-34-85 tanks, also used by the Soviets. So this vehicle would have been useful as an anti-aircraft weapon, obviously, that's what it was designed as. But as an anti-tank weapon, it would only be useful against most light tanks and some of the early model medium tanks used by the Axis or Allied powers that would have faced off against Sweden if they wanted to invade the territory. The speed of this vehicle was 40 kilometers per hour, or 24.8 miles per hour, and the vehicle had a crew of 5. Only a small number of these were actually made. Only about 30 to 40 of these vehicles were actually produced, and most of these were actually exported to Hungary and Finland, strangely enough. Although Sweden did keep some of these vehicles in use with their own armed forces. And there you have it. These were the Swedish anti-aircraft weapons of the Second World War, with the last vehicle being used as both an anti-aircraft weapon and also as an anti-tank vehicle. What do you think of these Swedish anti-aircraft weapons of World War II? Please tell me in the comments section below, and until next time, this was G-Man Time, signing off.